Let's pretend it is 1 year ago. I've just finished a game that has come close to being one of my favorite games of all time. It is still too early to fully tell if that is the case or not, but the fact of the matter is, this game left an impression on me. Why I'm revisiting Omori after making a video on it 1 year ago is because I looked back at that video recently and realized I really didn't talk about Omori. I talked about anything but Omori, and it was because that was kind of the point of the video. It wasn't really a video on Omori, it was a video ultimately about spoiling experiences. I talked about spoiling films, how much certain spoilers actually spoil the story, and how things that aren't spoilers spoil the game. Make sense? Well, if it doesn't, maybe 1 year ago me can explain it better. There'll be the few brief months or even a year where the community around the game was humble and fairly calm and collected. Then there'll be that moment where the peace times end and the fandom has taken control of the very identity of the game. And that is what I fear the most. There are people who grow tired of the game because there's nothing left of it to find. Then there are the people who grow tired of the game because they grow tired of the community. Alternatively, the title for the video tells you exactly what could spoil this game. That was my fear back then because this game rang every possible bell that could signify a wonderful game exploding with meteoric popularity. But recently, Omori has gotten another boost in popularity and relevance. What I'm referring to is the console release of the game. When I first made my video, the game was an English-only RPG that drew upon many Japanese RPGs and was only available on PC and Mac. Today, it not only has a Japanese, Chinese, and Korean translation that was released in December of last year, but also a release on all major consoles. I also just discovered I can technically play this on my phone. The future is crazy, man. So because there is undoubtedly a new influx of people discovering the game, and it appears the game is more popular than ever, why not spoil Omori? Psst, consider this your spoiler warning. Of course, where do we begin other than by answering what is Omori? In summary, in this game, you are a boy who goes on an adventure where the second member of your party is a girl and the other 2 slots are filled with 2 boys. There's many different parts of the game to explore, but thankfully, you will see every enemy you run into because despite whether you hate random encounters or don't really give a crap, at least having the option to avoid enemies is a plus. On top of that, the game's story is a Bildungsroman where by the end of the game, your character has learned and grown from the 20 to 30 hour long experience. No joke, that last paragraph says more about Omori than a 22-minute video did last July. Let's continue. The thing is, Omori really is a game that is best experienced blind. Not because you'll be surprised when you fight the planet Pluto, but because of symbolism and putting together the full story of the game. Part of the mission for me replaying this game wasn't only to have footage of the game while I talk over it, but because I knew things would start to make more sense on a second playthrough. There's details in this game that I didn't pick up on until after finishing it. Going through a second time allows me to connect these details into a more coherent understanding of this game's story. So bear with me on this tangent. You are not given a map to play Minesweeper because it is your job to make said map. There's points all over the map, but it's up to you to make sense of it. The game will give you clues on where the major points in the story are, but it is these clues that allow you to derive things that indicate the truth of these points. In terms of Omori, I know the conclusion of the game, and hell, I know most of the reasons why some things happen, but I am now interested in more minute details because looking back, this was a very detailed game and a story that goes beyond boy disassociates from the real world. As such, I am more interested in the way Omocat told this story. Hey, here's one more spoiler warning. Okay, so we know that Mary died. We also know that Mary used to play the piano and Sonny, her brother, played the violin. Yet something the developers of this game did, and not by accident, was make it where the very first sound you hear in this game is the piano theme for the game. This title theme is immediately established as a leitmotif that will appear several times throughout the game, just like most other RPGs. But in addition, the next song that is heard is the White Space theme. Although Mary does get her own theme as Bayou's Side, I can't help but also feel that the game's title theme and White Space are themes for Mary and Sunny, respectively. I'm going to talk about the music in greater detail later on, but we might as well get started with the story of the game. At the end of the day, the story is about a boy who has been inside of his house for 4 years after the tragic passing of his sister. For every single day for the past 4 years, he has dreamed up an RPG world where his friends at the time of his sister's passing go on an adventure. One of their friends, Pesto, goes missing, and it's the sole objective of the party to find him. Yeah, find him. Look, the problem with the story of Omori is that they never actually find their friend, and even begin to forget who he is and what he looks like. You are a party of 4, with Mary on the sidelines, with a quest so important that we deviate from the quest to find Kel's pet rock. Ultimately, Basil is more of a MacGuffin for the story than anything, as he is forgotten by the end, even though the entire adventure was supposed to be about finding him. I get that the adventure is about the journey and not the destination, but without the destination, doesn't that make the journey directionless? Let me now ask, why did we fight a space pirate and a princess? No, really. How does this lead to us finding Basil? I suppose after the fight with Captain Spaceboy, he did promise to help Omori and company by at least telling them if he did find Basil, he'd tell them. What this could have looked like was maybe a cutscene after a chapter spent looking for Basil, perhaps in some random place, where Captain Spaceboy shows up and says, "Hey, I found Basil," but he's locked in a castle. Let's say, instead of it being Sweetheart who owns a castle, it was some evil villain with a massive ego, but who actually has a plan for world domination and not just their own ego stroking. Then this castle section could be about not trying to escape from the castle, but instead infiltrate it. My point here is that Captain Spaceboy could easily be relevant to the whole plot of the game, but ultimately isn't used as such. Captain Spaceboy basically only serves to introduce us to Sweetheart because they used to be dating. So what does a space pirate and a Dunkin' Donut have to do with finding Basil? Nothing. That now brings us to Sweetheart. What the fuck does she do in this game? She definitely has some long cutscenes. It's a shame I defeated her in less time than some of her cutscenes. But anyway, she shows up and I guess is one of the villains of the game, but upon defeating her, the party is no closer to actually finding Basil. Now, with that said, functionally in the game, it does unlock the Lost Library, which is entirely relevant to the game. But bear with me for a moment. So Sweetheart shows up again later on in the Humphrey level, causes a bunch of chaos, then meets her own demise. Let me make it clear. Sweetheart should not even be aware of Basil's existence. We spend all this time effectively chasing her to the ends of the earth, from what it feels like, and we're no closer to Basil. Therefore, Sweetheart is pretty much just a roadblock to our party. And that's exactly what her purpose is in the game's story. Let me remind you of something. Headspace has one layer of storytelling to it, where it is the direct action that happens with the party and their adventure. Then there's the second layer of stuff happening in Sunny's mind. All of this was made up. So while Sweetheart's existence in the adventure doesn't really say anything about the adventure itself, it could indicate something about Sunny. The third layer is then Sunny actually being awake. It is in Faraway Town that some answers begin to be found, but it is in this second layer between the dream world and the real world where the real answers are found. To put it simply, Sunny and Omori are deliberately trying to forget who Basil is. It is no coincidence that the party just happens to forget who Basil is after a casino incident because Sunny, or Omori, is wanting these friends to forget about Basil. Effectively, remove Basil from Sunny's headspace. Make it where this adventure to find Basil goes on so many tangents that the party forgets what their original adventure was supposed to be about. After all, it was Aubrey who wanted to see Sweetheart's show. It was all three who wanted to help Captain Spaceboy, though Kel was the most enthusiastic to help. As for Hero, I mean, he was the one who worked closest with Jawsome at the casino. So going back, how you actually get to the big revelation and conclusion to Omori is really through the real life sections. These real life sections, however, are kind of boring on their own, at least compared to the Headspace sections. To me, I always preferred the Headspace sections just because I wanted to explore the world of Headspace. However, if you completely remove Faraway Town, you get an adventure that doesn't quite reach a conclusion. Therefore, the faraway town segments are the most important, but because the ending of the true route isn't about Headspace, but about the friends Sunny lost along the way. Let's just say that everyone involved in the story is characterized in Headspace more than in the real world section. At least, the versions of themselves from before Sunny stopped leaving his bedroom. This then is contrasted by the faraway town segments where everyone has gotten older, remained the same in certain ways, or changed in other ways. Notably, Kel is like 2 feet taller, yet still has the goofball personality we see in Headspace. Hiro is essentially still the adult of the group, being Kel's older brother, but we'll actually get to him in a moment. Then there's Aubrey, who has simultaneously changed the least and changed the most. Aubrey's character in Faraway Town is effectively at the center of the conflict in Faraway Town. So what happens is Aubrey has taken a photo album from Basil and bullies him in some way or another frequently, and eventually with the power of old friendship realizes she's an asshole. However, in a way, there is a justification to her actions. It is evident that she looked up to Mary, so for her Mary's death was devastating in one way that is different to everyone else. Her rage wasn't necessarily a blind rage, because from her point of view, these photos in the photo album are the only thing left of Mary. And Basil took a black marker to every picture with Mary in it. In addition, it feels like after Mary's death, she was abandoned by her friends. This is how she sees the situation, so to her, this is a righteous conflict. It is understandable, at a minimum, why Aubrey is upset at Basil, because in her eyes, why the fuck would one of her friends do this? What we end up with is ultimately a girl who in Sunny's mind had a crush on him growing up. Over time, she turns very cynical and feels like everyone has left her. So when she becomes friends with new people, it then makes total sense why upon the first interaction with Sunny in 4 years, she's incredibly defensive. It doesn't absolve her of her actions, but it is clear she had her reasons for her actions. However, she isn't the only one. For instance, Hiro was in love with Mary and after her death fell into a deep depression. Kel, who, while still maintaining a happy outside, certainly wasn't feeling that way in reality, especially seeing his brother the way he was. And frankly, let's not forget the brother of the dead girl who secluded himself from society for 4 years. I think what ultimately does redeem Faraway Town is that despite the gameplay not quite being on par with Headspace, even though the same battle system does show up here, the bulk of the story that matters is in the real world sections, where the story does get far more real than hunting bunnies in a forest. And that is the thing too. Why my preference for Headspace exists is entirely for the gameplay and world building. As an example, it is implied that there's a city underwater that I wish I could go to in the game, but can't at any point. This is the fun part of the game, but I fully recognize the importance of the faraway town segments juxtaposed to these more fun and carefree segments because there is a much greater importance, narratively speaking, to develop the plot around Mary's death and everyone's lives afterwards. So then what happens if I don't open this door for Kel and get what I might want instead? Though, I wouldn't be a good showman if I immediately spoiled the rest of Omori, so let's save that for later because I have a very important question to ask. So, when does this game take place again? Talking with some friends of mine, and as well from what I've seen online, the general range can be between 1985 and 2010. Okay, that's a span of 25 years, enough for a child to be born, go through their entire childhood, and graduate university. To me, one of the core themes of this game is childhood nostalgia, so when is Sunny nostalgic for? One thing that immediately threw me off towards the beginning is this house phone. Personally, I have no clue if my parents still even have a home telephone line because for the past 10 to 15 years, whenever I call them, I always call their cell phones. This alone sort of hard dates this game to before 2005, I'd say, because of another element that is seen in this game. In the junkyard part of the game, some of the enemies you have are flying oranges, space bunnies, but there's a few fights I've had with cassette tapes and dial-up modems. You can tell it's dial-up because the game directly references AOL's Running Man. But what I think really shows when Omori takes place is his computer. While I'm not too sure if he does or doesn't have a dial-up connection, what is clear is just how old his computer is. So, let's now look at his computer, or really his desktop computer and Omori's laptop. Laptops have been a thing since the 80s. Just as an example, the IBM ThinkPad launched in 1992, but it wasn't the first laptop. Now, if we look at both of these computers, it is clear they run some operating system that is in fact older than Windows XP. In my opinion, Sunny's desktop could either be running Windows 3.1 or 95 just from what we can see. However, Omori's laptop has to be running Windows 95 at the earliest. Why? Because Windows 95 introduced the taskbar as well as Windows Explorer, while Windows 3.1 used the Program Manager. Why I think the desktop computer could be running an older version of Windows compared to the imaginary boy's laptop is because this computer is older. Yeah, so depending on just how old, we may even be talking about a computer that doesn't even have Windows 3.1 on it, which means this blackjack game could either be a DOS game or a full-screen Windows 3.1 program. So, just to cover all my bases here, this desktop computer is definitely from before Windows 95's launch. This laptop seems to use Windows 95. That now puts us between 1990 and 1997, since Windows 98 would have come out in 1998. Now, why is this not Windows 98? Well, just trust me on this for the sake of time. There are enough things different between Windows 95 and 98 that makes me believe this is Windows 95. So then that means Mary died in 1995 and Sonny's perception of technology has stayed the same, right? Well, I don't think so, because you can upgrade Windows. So maybe in the 4 years that Sonny has been inside, he learned about Windows 95, perhaps through a dial-up connection, or by the single statistical chance of him maybe seeing a commercial for Windows 95 on TV in his house. He learned what Windows 95 was. Then, after doing so, for some reason decided to upgrade his imaginary friend's laptop to it. That means unless Sonny imagined Windows 95 well before it was released, we can say Omori takes place in 1995, and perhaps even the summer of 1995 specifically. The events of Mary's death would then have happened around 1991 or 1992. Either way, let's not overlook the fact that Sonny could upgrade imaginary Windows but couldn't get his imaginary friend a better laptop, leaving poor Omori to be stuck with Windows 95 in black and white mode. I guess it at least makes a good conversation piece for Omori when he has friends over. So long and short, the era of nostalgia this game is based around is, in fact, the 90s. Theoretically, it could even be 1995 specifically. However, in reality, I do not think the story was written to specifically take place in 1995, but instead to just take place in the 90s. There's several inconsistencies if you look deep enough into the game that simultaneously disprove my 1995 theory, but also just raise more questions. Either way, this now brings me to my actual point. Why I wanted to focus so much on where technology was in the early 90s is because Omori makes fantastic use of this time frame for its storytelling and as well visual aesthetic. For one, if there's going to be a story so focused on nostalgia in some way, then I feel it is vital for the story to get that time period right. Hypothetically, if I wrote a story about just this past decade, I can't really have people using iPod Nanos next to people using Nintendo Switches. On top of that, it is important to know the limitations of the time period as well. It is at this point we realize just how isolated Sonny is because at best, he may have been playing Doom Deathmatch over dial-up. However, it was more likely that given the context of the story, he really did just spend all of his time sleeping and imagining his own Super Nintendo JRPG. And Super Nintendo JRPG, this game kind of is, at least visually, and actually I'd probably compare it more to a computer game visually, but either way, let me just say it plainly, I do love the visual look of this game. Not only is Omocat's artwork pretty distinct and fits the game well, probably in large part because the game was formed around said artwork to begin with, but there is also the mix of real images and digital compression. Let me explain. Nowadays, it is entirely possible to get some pretty decent 4K footage off of an iPhone, but it wasn't always like this. In the days of 16 color modes, yes, 16 colors, not 16-bit colors, running on CRT displays, everything had a very unique look to it. For instance, dithering. Dithering is a technique used that applies noise to, in this case, an image. But what it is distinct for is its ability to take the average light levels of an image to create this almost stippling looking effect. Squint your eyes enough and you can kind of fill in the detail for an image, but zoom in enough and it becomes much harder to distinguish. In fact, it is possible that due to YouTube's compression or even H264 compression, which this video was exported in, that some of this effect is difficult to see. But this is a visual effect that is very common in Omori, from the battle screen Polaroids to the location backgrounds. Yet it should be noted the effect achieved with JPEG artifacting combined with the visual look of all the character sprites. Even though there's probably 3 or 4 frames for each stationary animation of a character, this illusion of movement does give far more character to the game's battles than a standard JRPG. Combine that with the obvious colored pencil or crayon look, and we now return to the childhood nostalgia aspect of this game. Case in point, the character of this game's visual style is made by taking what could be be seen as shitty image fidelity and making it charming. It's the same reason why pixel art isn't inherently shit because it is low resolution, as this technical limitation creates an entire art form that, when used correctly, does allow for good results. And now it is time to finally talk about the battle system of this game. There are two things that set this battle system apart from many other turn-based RPG systems. There's a follow-up system which allows for additional attacks mid-battle, and the emotion system. I'll be honest, this is the first elemental-like battle system I actually enjoyed because of just how simple yet varied it is. It's a triangle, basically, where happy beats angry beats sad beats happy. But the challenge comes from matching your emotions against your opponent, and sometimes your opponent having the ability to control your own emotions. This adds a wonderful layer of strategy to an otherwise run-of-the-mill combat system. And I mean, I would be overlooking the obvious if I didn't mention the meme potential of these emotions. It was kind of funny having happy Aubrey headbutt Captain Spaceboy while Kel annoyed himself to stop being sad. But combine this with almost a de facto system of party roles and you end up with a very solid battle system. And I should mention that, for the most part, your party's composition is pretty much decided for you. What I mean by that is, Hero is basically a battle mech at best, or just a normal medic, probably 85% of the time. There's two options for your party's tank, either being Aubrey or Kel. With that said, in my experience, Aubrey tends to have more health than Kel, yet I use her skills probably more often. But Kel does have a lot of magic points, so I would think it would be fairly easy to almost make him a battle mage. And then Omori is kind of a hybrid of battle mage and knight, because sometimes his knife is sharp enough to deal a lot of damage, or his skills are more than sufficient to get the job done. That might be one of my criticisms of the battle system, if I had to have one. To me, it doesn't feel like there's really a set specialization for any of the characters, nor the ability to really decide that for yourself. The only exception is maybe Hero, who pretty much universally heals everyone, from what his skills do to what many follow-up attacks involving him accomplish. So more often than not, I find Aubrey hitting the enemy with whatever she can get her hands on, Kel flexing to charge his attack, Hero healing everyone, and Omori basically keeping the party together. Understanding all this is going to be the most important thing for your own enjoyment, however. I think because I took to this battle system very quickly, a lot of my enjoyment of this game has come from how satisfying the battles are in this game. Minus a couple exceptions, there's never a battle that feels way too long, or a battle that feels impossible. There are battles that feel pointless, such as killing a level 1 bunny when your whole party is well above level 20. But I guess what I'm saying is it was very satisfying to have Omori go in for a stab while Aubrey summoned a rain cloud over Sweetheart. So let's talk about that. One thing I learned after making my video is the Sweetheart battle is hard. Yeah. To me, this was not really a hard fight. On my first run, maybe it took longer than it did this second time, but I did defeat her on my first try. I think I do see why some people may struggle in this fight though, as Sweetheart is the second major boss of the game, and it is kind of clear that she is more competent than even Spaceboy was before with using the emotion system. With that said, I think it does come back to understanding how to utilize this battle system and perhaps even doing any of the side events. Both times, I'm pretty sure I defeated this plant boss before defeating Sweetheart, along with this army of bears underneath her garden. Therefore, it could be that I was just at a higher level than I should have been the first time I played. I'll admit, for this playthrough, while I never really spent a lot of time grinding, it was kind of easy to get up to level 25 just by spending time doing side quests and killing enemies along the way. However, I do want to point out this clip I'm always reminded of when considering the difficulty in RPGs.
Why is there a level 80 guy in the baby starting area? And you can just aggro him from anywhere on the map. Oh, there he is now. Hey!
Why here?
Hey, that's a good question. Why are you here?
There is a fine balance between making the game stupidly easy and having a very clear flaw in the progression of the game. To me, Omori does not really do this unless you go out of your way. So for instance, if you do not fight any of the level 1 bunnies, then you will absolutely have a hard time by the time you get to Other World. So long as you fight the enemies that you just run into, you should be pretty good throughout the game because then you are progressing as the game goes on. To me, Omori does this damn near perfectly, and honestly, my own preferences would almost say that the game is a tad easy in that respect. With my own preference, I would probably add more complexity to some battles or make some enemies a bit more intelligent, but besides that, I do think this game is very satisfying to play. Speaking of satisfying, the sounds in the battles for this game are exactly that. When Omori stabs an enemy in the heart, as the battle screen says, it somehow feels as impactful in large part because of the sound effect the game plays. This elevator chime, combined with what sounds like some kind of metallic impact, is so satisfying, along with several other sounds in the game. However, and maybe this is just an example of the law of near enough, there's almost a rhythmic quality to these sound effects too. It sometimes feels like the sounds are happening to the rhythm of the music. The best part of Omori to me has to be the music. Not only has Sonny managed to create an entire RPG world in his head, he also created his own soundtrack that is simply incredible. Maybe, after he moves away, he'll finally download Ableton and start making some music. Either way, the obvious highlights of the soundtrack are the boss themes. For me, Chaos Assembly sold me on the game's soundtrack. At that moment, I thought that was the best song I had heard in the game yet. I figured if this mini-boss theme was this good, then surely there'd be a few more songs that were just as good or better. Then, just a few minutes later, I fought Captain Spaceboy. You Were Wrong, Go Back is not a song I expected to hear as early in the game as I did, but from this point onward, there was almost always a boss fight with an awesome theme to go with it. I mentioned the Sweetheart Battle before, but honestly, I cannot mention that and not mention Waltz and Valentine. Can't tell me this isn't awesome. Other honorable mentions include the previously mentioned Chaos Assembly, Forest Frenzy, It Means Everything, Golden Vengeance, and Underwater Prom Queens. Apart from the boss themes though, there's Poems in the Fog, Firefly Forest Cat's Cradle, Wandering Rose, Three-bar Logos, The Elegance of the Mysterious and Distant, Gator Gamble, By Your Side, Lost Library, and, of course, Duet. I tend to spend a fair bit of time talking about music in these videos. I wonder why. This time, however, I want to take a step further and not just talk about the music of Omori, but the people who made the music too. The thing is, this is far different to some other indie games. On one end of the spectrum, famously, is Toby Fox doing most if not all of the music for Undertale in addition to being the person making the entire rest of the game. Omori is far from that end of the spectrum because it actually had a decently large team working on it for an indie game. This in turn resulted in 3 people doing the soundtrack. It's a tad difficult to pinpoint who did what songs. On Bandcamp, the credit of the whole album is given, but not for each individual track. Luckily, on YouTube, each song does say who made it, and on top of that, the community has created a list based on this data so it is easy to tell who composed what. Most of the music was created by Pedro Silva, followed by Jamie Lin and Bo In. Bo In only contributed 3 songs to the project, but it should be noted that these are 3 pretty prevalent songs in the game, with 2 being area battle themes. But what I am interested in demonstrating is where the sound of Omori comes from. After all, for how cohesive the sound of this game is, it would be expected that a little bit of each of these composers' sounds would make it into the game in some way. Though, I should note that while some of these comparisons are not exactly one-to-one, I think there's a few similarities in these examples to not just the songs I compare them to, but also other moments in the Omori soundtrack. Basically, this is where I think the general feel of the soundtrack comes from. Take a listen and let me know what you think afterwards.
Now I'm waiting by the phone. I know we've been here before, and I said I could change. I knocked on your door, could you every day, and I lost myself.
I should also note that I almost attributed 2 songs to the wrong person for the previous comparison. To me, there was a bit of an overlap in Jamie Lin and Pedro Silva's sounds. Take a listen. So if any of these songs sounded interesting to you, definitely check out the other music-related projects by the game's composers. For Pedro Silva, it will mostly be Slime Girls that you're looking for, and for Jamie Lin, it is Clover and Sea Life. As for Bo-In, well, his discography is a bit more interesting because there's a chance you've actually heard his work before in other indie games and even much more popular games. If you find his Pale Machine album and find yourself wanting more, then you should definitely look towards his video game soundtracks. Lovely Planet, Pikuniku, and recently Pornpy are 3 examples of the minigames he has composed for. Oh yeah, and he also composed the soundtrack for the Nintendo Switch launch title, Snipper Clips. So like I said, there's a possibility you may have heard his work before without realizing it was him. Long and short, the composers and musicians behind the Omori soundtrack are talented individuals. I encourage all of you to listen to more of their stuff because without this game's soundtrack, I feel like half the character of this game would be missing. It would only be appropriate to also support their other projects if you feel so inclined, because why limit yourself to only a portion of someone's music when they've got more out there to listen to? Fortunately, awesome music is to be expected in either route, so you really aren't missing much depending on what decision you make with Kel. However, on a second playthrough, you may want to pick the other option.
Psst, this is your final spoiler warning.
The biggest difference between the normal and Hikikomori routes is actually not that much. I mean, yeah, you do lose out on all of Faraway Town, but considering that a majority of the game is spent in Headspace anyway, it almost isn't noticeable. If anything, having to wake up from Headspace becomes a bit of a burden because it's like pausing your game to go take out the trash or answer the door for a delivery. In fact, I'm surprised taking out the trash wasn't one of the things you had to do in this game because in place of Faraway Town, where you reconnect with your childhood friends, you're sweeping. Yes, on this channel, I've covered RPG Maker games that, instead of using an RPG battle system, focus on navigating an abandoned hospital, finding a dead girl, employing stealth mechanics to get past doll turrets, and taking a walk through an art museum. Omori may be the first RPG Maker game I've played where chores are part of the gameplay. I take back everything I said before about Faraway Town being boring. I'd rather do all of that over sweeping. But it gets better because, get this, on day 2, you wash dishes. So obviously, this route shifts all the focus from getting over your reclusiveness and instead allows Sunny to further indulge in his escapist fantasy. My recommendation is, if you are going to do this route, do all the side quests and optional shit too, because otherwise the game is a fair bit shorter. No major plot points change for about 60% of the game. For instance, the villain doesn't change from a donut roadblock to an everything bagel of a villain, complete with Bond villain scheming and henchmen. You still have to deal with Sweetheart. So then what actually does change? From the point where you do not open the door for Kel to the point after defeating Humphrey, nothing significant changes from what I can tell. It was hard for me to tell, but something did feel different beginning with Humphrey. Actually, and someone please tell me if I am wrong in thinking this, there was this one part where an apple turns into Sunny's head and you eat it. I don't remember this happening in the normal route, and on top of that, this apple of knowledge type of symbolism, I suppose, does scream out as something that would be specific to this route. Ultimately, I don't know if this is unique to this route or not. Now, where the game changes is with Black Space, where after going through these doors, you confront Basil. Sort of. You actually confront the stranger, but it is done after saving Basil. It was at this moment the game's route finally caught my attention because Sunny is defeated by the stranger, and in his moment of defeat begins crawling up these red stairs. Eventually, he encounters Omori, who then goes to defeat the stranger for him. Then, with the stranger gone and only Omori and Basil left, we then begin to walk up a long path of red hand stairs to, this place. I'm going to be honest, this whole sequence doesn't really make a lot of sense without an explanation and a fair bit of elaboration. So let me start at the beginning again so that this may begin to make more sense. Sunny is a boy whose sister died and in response has secluded himself from reality. Sunny envisions himself as Omori, who goes on adventures with his friends. The Lost Forest section explains how Headspace came to be, with it sort of being implied Black Space is beginning to invade Headspace, albeit slowly. During this adventure, as they reach what should be an end, they actually reach more of a Truman Show-like wall, where beyond this point, anything is up for grabs. I compare it to the Truman Show because after defeating Humphrey, this is the physical end of the adventure world. You shouldn't be able to go any further, but you do because this is where we move into that second narrative layer I mentioned earlier. After Humphrey is explained, Sunny has been through these adventures multiple times, with each of them slightly different, and whenever they get close to finding the truth, the adventure resets and the remnants of that adventure are disposed of. No matter what, Basil is the truth they're trying to find, and Mary guides them, which partially explains why she essentially travels our same journey yet is never once part of our party. In other words, Sunny has been dreaming in Endless 8 for 4 years, but even being outside of the loop, I guess doesn't realize what he's doing. So with all that exposition, let us now get to the ending of Black Space. This ending takes a moment to process, but it does make total sense. I said before that Black Space is slowly creeping into Headspace, which despite sounding so obvious, is somehow something I didn't view as an actual conflict, much less the real conflict of Omori. Seriously, I just thought Sunny was beginning to fall out of his imaginary world. I didn't realize the game was also trying to paint it as some form of corruption. This alone explains things like the fissures that show up after picking up correct hangman keys. However, it also explains the stranger appearing in random places, something occasionally appearing, or even the moments that bring Omori back to white space, aka the barn on the first night, the lost library in the second night, and Basil's house, which turns into the entrance for Black Space. So whenever Headspace becomes too consumed by what is otherwise the truth is when the adventure resets to the beginning. What I think we witness in Black Space, with this route's Black Space ending in particular, is this exact reset. I think what we are seeing is, after reaching another reset point with his party, Omori returning to Black Space to reset the world. He has to enter here because this is how he resets Headspace. This is where we get new copies of the friends, a new Mary, and most importantly, a new Basil. Hopefully, this time they won't freak out, but if they do, then we go on another adventure to delay having to get a new Basil in hopes that everyone just forgets about him. The longer we spend not thinking about the truth, the better it is for Sunny. Why this is so different to the other route is because of Sunny going outside. In a normal route, by going outside, Sunny is confronting the truth outside the safety of his own head, aka Omori. Meanwhile, the beast Sunny has created is able to keep Sunny from the truth because, well, he never confronts it in the Hikikomori route. Black Space doesn't ever have Sunny confront the truth because the truth that matters isn't the vats from where his friends are manufactured or the pit where they are eventually disposed of, but the truth that is revealed in the true route. Pardon the strange literary comparison, but this does sort of remind me of Brave New World to a degree. If we remove the first couple chapters of Brave New World, you end up with a story that feels very odd and is as if something is off. However, with the context of the first couple chapters featuring concepts such as the manufacturing of humans that are designed to fit a certain caste system, it begins to make more sense as to how the society in Brave New World functions. This is very important to understanding Brave New World, which is why it is in the very beginning of the book. Now, besides the manufacturing of humans, why Omori reminds me of Brave New World is because of how fucked up both universes are. Ignoring the central conflict of John's whole existence in the book, what is presented is a utopia of ignorance and bliss. No one questions the systems that feel sinister to us, the viewer, because everyone is high on Soma. Even so, when the systems do get questioned, no one is really morally against them because they see no inherent moral contradiction. To us, it is clear as day, but it isn't for anyone in the book because Brave New World is meant to be as alien to us as possible, to express a certain attitude towards the direction of humanity, in the opinion of one particular British author in 1932. Headspace, in turn, feels strangely similar because it is Sunny living in pure ignorance. However, unlike the people in the book, Sunny exists in a world that we can safely assume isn't too different to our own. So for Sunny, he spends 4 years keeping himself in a state of ignorance, with continued ignorance given the conclusion of the Hikikomori route. Omori, on the other hand, who is a thing created by Sunny to deal with Mary's death, serves to keep Sunny safe from the truth of this whole existence. In other words, while Omori isn't even the dealer of Soma for Sunny, he definitely is the part of Sunny that was made to hold the keys to the truth and to protect these keys at all costs. This single modus operandi is then what leads to the evil witnessed in Black Space and beyond. In a way, I now have an even greater appreciation for this game's story because I went through this route wondering how Mary's death would be handled. Because Sunny doesn't ever reach the stage of confronting what happened, he ultimately continues to reject it ever happening. Then, because he does completely write off any possibility of it happening, this is when we witness Omori taking over Sunny. It is at this point that I find myself feeling like this should be the end of the game, however. I do like this story a lot, don't get me wrong, but I feel like for the sake of this game being a game, there are a couple elements missing. For one, let me actually state the first ending I got after leaving Black Space. I discovered that it is possible for Sunny to die after becoming Omori. While very morbid, I think this is one appropriate ending of many. This is before you re-enter Headspace, but effectively this would be at the end of the story arc. For this tragedy, there's two possible endings. One, the classic Shakespearean ending, where the main character dies. Macbeth, Hamlet, Romeo and Juliet. These characters die at the end because not only is that a trait of the Shakespearean tragedy, but their purpose in the story is no longer present. If Sunny is no more, and it actually is Omori now, then this makes sense as one ending. 2. Continuing on. Have an epilogue where Sunny lives as Omori, and the real tragedy is that Sunny is no longer himself. In a way, it is a bit like the portrait of Dorian Gray to a certain extent, and if I had more time, I could draw a few more connections. But, as cliche as this may sound, I do feel like a final boss is missing in either situation. In the true route, perhaps one of the most emotional parts of the game, the climax sees Sunny fighting Omori. The initial shock, followed by the music coming in, set the stage for the climax of this game, and without this moment, I feel like the game would be missing the most important part of its ending. I feel a similar way with the Hikikomori route, where it would be pure poetry to maybe not have Omori fight Sunny, but instead have Omori actually fight the stranger. I think in a similar way, where the true route hands you the violin bow to kill the character you've built this whole game, the game should now hand you the knife to kill Sunny's last hope at redemption. The actual fight present in the game should still be there, no doubt, because it shows Sunny as succumbing to his fears and weaknesses. But I think to fully drive home how evil the character you've built this whole game is, you need to be the one to swing that knife. But hey, it can't hurt to keep going down this path. After all, I think there's an interesting quality in returning to Headspace to finish everything. You get conclusions to certain storylines, you get a pretty unique take on the battle system via the space ex-husband fights, and you also get about 10 more hours of stuff to do. The thing is, when I did get to the end, fought my last fight, saved one more time, and checked in with Mary to find all the quests completed, I didn't really feel anything. The conclusion really was 10 hours earlier when exiting Black Space, not 10 hours later when Sunny rediscovers the outside. As such, while I did walk around a little bit just to see a couple places one last time, I ended up ultimately closing out the game appreciating that I just finished my favorite RPG. But I still sort of wanted more. Or maybe I wanted less. I feel like this was done on purpose because the world has reset now. It is up to Sunny's mind to just invent a new adventure when the time comes. Otherwise, until Basil acts up again, we're just seeing a pretty world built on the foundation of many dark secrets. And in fact, that does bring me to one last part of the game that I want to talk about. While I did like the atmosphere of Snow Globe Mountain and going to find Captain Spaceboy to bring him back from exile, I didn't enjoy the atmosphere of the Abyss. There was something genuinely creepy about this whole area. When I heard the name initially, I figured there'd be a decent bit of exploring, but instead, it is like crawling through underwater caves. You start off with some of the enemies from the previous section, but they slowly turn into these black masses that, when defeated, offer no XP. Everyone but Omori is scared. There's skeletons on the wall, and some of them look familiar. At the bottom of the abyss is one last creature. In darkness, they lie sleeping. But upon approaching them, their one eye opens. This was a very strange fight and was very uncomfortable to go through. It is made worse by the end when she is pleading for her life. This wasn't an easy fight either, as I did have to try it a second time, and it ended up being quite the endurance fight. But it is very clear that Omori isn't scared of this thing. Instead, it is Abby who is scared of Omori. If you do spare Abby, you get access to the party's final weapons and a few charms, but it is very, very clear that this is more so Abby paying tribute to Omori in hopes that she isn't the next thing he kills. Ultimately, why I feel like this is such an important fight is because of Abby being Abby and not some kind of abyss monster. What I mean is, while this whole time you can kill enough bunnies to get an achievement for it, this is the first boss that is scared of us. In fact, I just realized, who are the bosses in this game who die? Sure, these random enemies die, presumably, but Pluto is just fine, if not stronger, after our fights. Captain Spaceboy returned to his crew twice. Sweetheart lived to see her wedding, then to get eaten by a whale, and then to become a maid. Continuing on, the slime girls do not die because of us, and in fact they survive as well. Humphrey doesn't die at all, the unbred twins don't die, and even Boss from the beginning survives and starts his own business. So then who the hell dies in Omori? Looking at it, there's a couple candidates. The Internet Explorer download window dies. What the fuck kind of sentence is that? So does King Crawler. So does King Carnivore. Anyone in the Sir Maximus lineage minus Sir Maximus IV, that one Sprout Mole boss from the beginning, the Sprout Mole who tried to sell us cryptocurrency. Snally, the stranger at the hands of Omori, and then finally Abby, so long as we make that decision. In other words, all the bosses who are human or humanoid survive, except for a robot and a melting candlestick. Then there's the stranger whose death I explained previously, and Abby, who clearly has the face of a human girl and not, say, a Sprout Mole. This is what I think makes Abby so unique, is that they are the one fight in this game where not only are they human in some way, but they also beg for mercy. This fight isn't about protecting Sunny, we are beyond that. This fight is about power. Ultimately, who has control over Sunny and who holds the keys to the truth, as that was the main conflict between Omori and the stranger. Both routes deal with the same fact patterns for roughly 2/3 of the game. These routes deviate because of a decision made by Sunny. After the prologue, Sunny decides to either leave the safety of his escapist fantasy and confront the trauma from 4 years prior, or he decides to continue living in his own head. Because he moves away, because he doesn't see the place where his sister died, because he doesn't see anything that reminds him of her, because his old friends are no longer around, and because he has committed to not confronting the past, it is almost certain he will never deal with the events occurring on the night of the recital. In place of that, he is no longer Sunny, and instead becomes his imaginary friend, Omori, a small and vulnerable child in front of a veil of complete darkness. The only thing left is for him to go around picking imaginary fights and defeating imaginary enemies. Crazy idea, but hear me out. Sunny is dead for a majority of the game and Mary is still alive. If we are to believe that Mary did die, then she died when she was 15, the same age as Hiro. We know that Hiro is off at university and that he is 19 years old. Therefore, no matter if he's in his freshman or sophomore year of university, Mary would be in university at the same time as him if she was still alive. And that's the thing. She is still alive, and in fact was coming home from university for the summer. What do we know about the real world by the first time you leave Headspace? Nothing, except this image of a violin. After that, we discover the power is out at Sunny's house, which is when things start to get a bit odd. I don't know much about answering machines, but I did try looking to see if the 90s had battery backup answering machines where you could still listen to your messages if the power went out. I had no luck in finding that. Therefore, I think this voice message from Sunny's mom was made up in Sunny's head. Next, Sunny struggles to go down the stairs because not only is he scared of heights, it's also pitch black in his house. But even if he takes one step a minute, eventually, given enough time, he'll be near the bottom of the stairs and then can walk to the kitchen. That now brings us to the kitchen and this steak. First, if the power is out, how the fuck is the refrigerator on? And second, if the power is out, how the fuck is Sunny microwaving it? Not only should Sunny not microwave steak, but he's not even doing that. He's just putting it in a lukewarm box for 40 seconds, then pulling it out, and then eating a cold steak. How long has this post-it notes actually been on Sunny's wall? A couple hours or a couple days? Now, with that said, after Sunny eats his uncooked steak, he then instantly gets food poisoning. I guess the steak is so off that Sunny would have gotten more nutritional value from eating plaster. This is where I think even more of Sunny's hallucinations begin because he then throws up, which, mind you, shouldn't immediately cure his condition. There's then a knocking on the door coming from Mary, who is outside. In this state of panic, as his vital organs are beginning to fail, he tries to get to the door, ultimately unable to open it, or, if he does, is terrified when he sees his sister. That is to say, in his dying moments, he thinks he sees this hellspawn instead of the smiling face of Mary. That means everything after this is made the fuck up. So, let me now reframe the story of Omori. Sunny dies from very bad food poisoning on the night his sister is supposed to return from university. She's coming home to help her mother and little brother move. Mary arrives right after Sunny eats the uncooked steak. Mary then tries to help her brother, but unfortunately, he passes on. Before Sunny passes on, however, his mind creates one final RPG campaign around guilt he feels towards Mary. I never denied that Sunny pushed Mary down the stairs. Instead, I think Mary survived, although in poor condition for a while, but was able to mostly recover. Sunny, however, has never gotten over this guilt, with it invading his dreams at night. Even to his dying breath, he hasn't been able to move on. He dreams of Mary dying 4 years prior from the incident, and him separating himself from their old friends out of shame. At this point where the campaign is over and his dream world truly ends, being this church at the end of Black Space, Sonny gets one final reminder of how he died and proceeds to the afterlife. In the Hikikomori route, he enters the hell of the never-ending Headspace campaign, and in the true route, he enters heaven after coming to terms with what he did. And on that bombshell, whether Sonny died from food poisoning or from his imaginary friend taking over his body, it's time for Omori to fight something a little bit harder.